purpose of this talk is to introduce everybody to the Big Ten Neurosurgery Consortium. And we're joining, and I've more.
Yeah, the fans are over there.
Okay.
It's really loud. So
We're working on, so we're gonna install microphones in here. This has been a problem, so thank you for giving us feedback.
As we talk about this, you'll kind of realize we're still in the very early stages planning to getting this up off the ground. But I did think it was important to promulgate the objectives of this consortium early on, because this is an opportunity for us to really have an active voice in how this is framed and in a way that I think makes sense. And the primary focus of the consortium is the conduction of multi-site clinical trials. So we'll start with kind of some first principles about like why to do clinical trials in the first place, right? Because obviously we have a number going on here, but I think through training, I didn't really appreciate a lot of the nuances and behind the scene work that went on. You know, I knew we would have like the BOOST trial and there's endovascular trials and pediatric hydrocephalus network, but I never really understood that well. I think the behind the scenes stuff and what a lot of the driving forces were behind it. And I think the reasons to do it are kind of some of the reasons, you know, that all of us try to extract from our work in the first place, and want to learn about various pathologies, why people get certain illnesses, disorders, what things make them better, what things make them worse, opportunity to innovate, to develop new things, change standards of care, change treatment paradigms, to grow, you know, obviously both as individuals and as a department and a service as a whole. Trials are really a drawing factor, especially, at least I'll speak for brain tumors. A high number of the patients in my clinic are like, look, I want to come here, I want to do trials, I want to know what you have to offer. I want more than just what standard. That end, you know, Patrick Nguyen at Dana-Farber would be very open and say, oh, look, he would keep trials open forever for like as long as possible, just so he could say, yeah, most trials, which I think is, you know, in some ways a little bit of a cynical view of things, but you get the point. And the reasons that's not really practical for everybody. It's not the most efficient or cost-effective way to do things. But I think it does speak to the fact that, you know, this is something that patients really want, is to be part of. The next, what are some of the challenges, right? And these are some of the things that the consortium is at least hoping to address or partially ameliorate. Are the trials are hard, right? Take a lot, effort. Cost is pretty expensive, right? Insurance will cover a lot of standard of care things, basic labs, procedures. Really part of getting a trial up and off the ground and budget sorted is a Medicare cost analysis, saying what this will RV pay for. What about the other stuff, the investigational agents, additional procedures, these things like that. It's a part we have to figure out is where is that money going to come from? Kind of like three main sources. So one would be some sort of federal funding, that sort of thing. Industry, which we'll see as a large part of the focus of this consortium. It will help grease the wheels a bit. And then philanthropy, a lot of the big, you know, cancer sites, at least, big part of their budget is on a regulatory stuff at every level, at the institutional, federal level. The number of acronyms and committees, like IRB, SRC, IBC, all these things take time. They're site-specific things you have to clear. Just the coordination of all of it, you know, the actual execution of the trial, preparation of an agent, collection of data, things like that. It's very slow, right? Takes years often for agent intervention to go into the clinical testing phase, and actually, if it makes it all through into FDA clearance, to make it into actual practice and use. A lot of the things, just, you know, getting an IND requires things like CMC, preclinical data, all these regulatory things that can take months. And even after you have FDA approval for something, then you can have your own institutional approval for agents that can also take months. All these things take a really long time. Then there's just a matter of accrual, that you have something you really want to offer. of the trial. It's like, well, how do you make sure you have enough patients to actually get the numbers you need, study sufficiently powered, and get them to actually buy into it. So there's a lot of barriers here. Part of what the consortium is part of it, or intended to do, is to help sort of catalyze, lower the activation energy for some of these hurdles. This is a consortium. It's based on the Big Ten. So those of you who aren't college sports fans, you may not know, but we're part of the Big Ten. You'll notice the Big Ten has a lot more than 10 schools part of it, 18. And it really kind of falls under the umbrella of the Big Ten Academic Alliance, which like on their home screen, this little splash page welcoming us in Oregon and USC and UCLA. Academic Alliance was actually started as kind of the academic counterpart to the athletic conference, like way back in the 50s. Well, playing football together, why don't we do some academic intellectual stuff too? And that's more broadly at like the university level, not necessarily medicine specific, certainly not neurosurgery specific. But since our joining the conference in the last couple of years, and we were now technically considered part of the Big Ten Academic Alliance. So I wanted to go over like their vision and mission statements, and you'll see that a lot of these things should sound familiar. So in terms of vision, we have collaboration among the neurosurgery departments, leverage shared resources, large patient population, accelerate our ability to answer important questions, solve impactful problems, provide the highest quality care for our patients. The mission is to facilitate collaboration in realms of research, education, and patient care to enhance our ability to better the lives of patients. Like, research, education, patient care, that's a lot like our own departmental mission statement: best care for our patients, discover novel treatments, educate future generations. I think the overall, broad speaking, goals are pretty well aligned. But who are actually, all these departments and schools that are involved? Notice this map doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like this big cluster here, Big Ten, even this is, 14 schools, goes all the way to the Atlantic, way out here. Whether it makes geographic sense or not, it covers a lot of people. And the estimated catchment area for all these areas combined is, over a third of the population of it. So that's a lot of people here that even for some of our neurosurgical disorders and diseases are relatively rare, offset that by just basically having a large patient population to draw from, which I think is a concept that we kind of get from the WAMI organization anyway. The idea is that kind of all these school programs can work together, from a monetary, a time, a data management, regulatory, legal, patient population resources to really grow the power of conducting these trials. In doing so, you hope to develop things like, some uniformity among the schools in terms of like the management, the infrastructure, the data collection. These, I think, are a really critical point when you're talking about any sort of multi-site efforts, but particularly with trials, it's like, how do you ensure that there's site-to-site variability and how you conduct the procedures, the data you collect, management and storage and administration of agents, all these sorts of things. So that'll be one of, I think, the big hurdles to clear, and one of the things that a lot of the potential industry partners really care about is making sure that there is that uniformity across sites. I've seen things, because with like gene therapy studies, where they're like, man, we don't really get this good data. And then when they go actually look at like images of where they stuck the cannula at certain sites, it's like they were just wildly off target, and it's just poor essentially. And that's a big part of, I think, what this consortium is going to need to address, is making sure that there's adequate training at individual sites and that certain standards are met to make sure that there's actual adherence and uniformity across practices. A lot of resources and specialties that can be leveraged and shared at great geographical distances. And then a big part of it is kind of the last 2 points, is just making things just faster, smoother, more. That's really a big part about the limitation of federally funded trials, and what we want to see is that they can get relatively fast startups, rapid responses, and communication. So there's some precedence for these consortia. So this is perhaps the best known example, the NeuroNext, so primarily neurologic disorders, things like spinal muscular atrophy, things like that. This is an NIS sponsored effort, started in like 2011 with 18 different programs. They have this, complicated org chart for how they do things, an executive committee that reviews studies and ends up selecting some of them. And then they basically network all the different execution and data management and all these things across the different sites. And they had like 70 different proposals that they considered, and they ended up launching about 8 different clinical trials and were able to meet all their approval timelines at or ahead of schedule, publish a lot of high quality papers and high impact journals, develop all these relationships, things like that. So there's some precedence for the success of this type of network. A big part of it is that standardization. This is just, a wall of text here showing things like you need a master clinical trial agreement, dozens of standard operating procedures for things like site selection, project management, all these different things, and then just a memorandum of understanding. This is kind of the phase we're at. Surgical Consortium, this is very much in line with like what you said to me many times about clinical trials, like paperwork. And it requires a lot of ancillary staff, clinical research managers, coordinators, et cetera, legal teams to get all this in place and make sure all this is covered. That's stuff that I think we as neurosurgeons are not necessarily the best suited for or patients for sometimes. So it really requires a large team, large effort to make this successful. As further evidence of precedence, within the Big Ten, a cancer research consortium was started a little over 10 years ago. So this is not just neurologic, neurosurgical things, but just all cancer. A lot of it, obviously, is hem-onc. They started this similar consortium at ASCO in 2013. And you can get a sense of the timeline that it takes to really get things up and off the ground. They had this idea in their first meeting in 2013, and then year to establish a foundation, and then another year to open their first study, and then they have a summit a year after, and it takes time to kind of get that snowball and get that momentum going. But they have hundreds of researchers, patients enrolled, over 30 studies, and 15,000 different tumor samples and blood samples for their research and analysis. We were at kind of like the beginning of that timeline from the neurosurgical standpoint. We had our first consortium meeting in LA early this year in January down at the Omni, somewhere in this wall of my fellow neurosurgical dorks, where we all kind of got together and talked about our visual programs, the things we do, the sorts of research we're involved in, current trials, and this is just an example of the agenda. And it's mostly just the 18 programs getting up in front of each other and saying, hey, this is how many cases we do. We have these capabilities, these are the things that we could potentially do as a site for future clinical trials. There's been a lot of where a number of the speaker slots are for industry partners as well, many of which we either worked with or certainly familiar with, probably have our own working relationships with, because they're very eager to be part of these trials as well. Whether it's a collaborative effort, us bringing ideas to them, then bringing ideas to us, all these kind of things. And I think that that's a big part, again, of the focus of this is how do we use those relationships to help streamline this whole process. These are some basic stats about the consortium and just kind of the potential numbers of patients and surgeries and things that the group as a whole use. So, nearly 500,000 outpatient visits a year across the different sites, thousands and thousands of all the different kinds of surgeries that, we are certainly a big portion of each of these. I will tell you, everyone gets up there and puts up their numbers about number of cases. Like we are definitely at the top, no surprise. Given our volume that, we're a very big contributor to a lot of these numbers. And so a lot of the other sites and companies are very interested in having be part of this just because of our great experience here. So that's over 50,000 surgeries a year of various types, and huge numbers of staff, basic scientists, translational researchers, and again a very large number of clinical research support staff that are really key in like making all these things actually run, making sure that, you know, visits happen, data is managed appropriately, protocols that are adhered to, all these sorts of things. All of the sites have some sort of like biobanking, biospecimen repositories, investigative pharmacies, capabilities for remote monitoring. Over 80% of them have access to some sort of clinical research unit. Listed those clinical research staff that I was talking about. And then a lot of funding for trials already. I think there were over like 300 something trials across the 18 sites already in place, about 70 of which were NIH funded. So a big part of these are being run by things other than federal. Key part to the numbers is the fact that going to be using a central IRB for all this. So rather than have everybody go through their own little institutional review and then somehow trying to make all the pieces fit together essentially after the fact, a lot of that will be ceded to WCG, group that's been affiliated with and approved by the FDA for this sort of thing. So that really cedes some of the responsibilities for IRB review, like the HIPAA review and IRB review. There are still some things that have to be done locally at the site, but it's actually now a requirement at the NIH to have a single IRB since I think 2020 for any multi-site federally funded trials. Even if it's only like one of the sites that has federal funding, you do have to use some sort of single central IRB. And like Ohio State, which is kind of one of the main driving forces behind this consortium, they ceded all their industry-sponsored clinical trial stuff to WCG over 20 years ago, and just do everything. And I think this will be key for really streamlining the process and making things go faster, and again, ensuring that uniformity, which will be key. Now, this just goes over some of the advantages. Obviously, we talk about the NIH requirement, the fact that it's a single review, all the human subject concerns have to be adhered to, and that really there's just kind of one person or one team steering the ship. You still have some issues of coordination; those can't totally be obviated, and it really requires like execution. That's obviously not true just for the IRB, but for really all aspects of the trial execution design. So this is kind of a sample workflow about how people see it working. You know, somebody puts an idea, and then at the annual Big Ten meetings, which we have various working groups for the individual subspecialties. So on the executive committee and part of the working group for the tumor subsection, and there are others obviously for endovascular spine. And kind of at that go over and say, well, which are the ones that make sense and which are the ones we want to go forward with. And once that's agreed to, then the process of coming up with the MCTA, all the IRB agreements, and collecting data. There are a lot of steps to that, and one of the first things that I'll cover in a little bit is really just figuring out, well, what sites can really do these kinds of trials. Who really can, one, perform the intervention or administer the agent, enroll enough patients, and I'll show you one of those forms in a little bit. This is a key thing that we're just figuring out, like whether our site as the university makes sense to participate in this. The Clinical Coordination Center is primarily through Ohio State. They have a very large infrastructure, so they were the first center to conduct one of those NeuroNext studies. They have a very large clinical resource staff and a lot of the framework for conducting these sort of multi-site trials. And then Iowa really has an extensive data coordination center. So a lot of the data will be managed through that. Some things may vary, most of these things will be taken on a case-by-case basis. So if there are trials where that doesn't make sense, then may deviate from that. We go through the feasibility, site selection, budget, like training, all these things before getting things off the ground. I'm going to kind of editorialize a little bit about the key things to, I think, make this portion and trials in general a success. The trials get dinged a lot for their low success rate, especially neuro-oncology. Very few things actually make it to phase 3 and clear and actually into practice. A big thing for the consortium will obviously be collaboration. And I don't mean just among surgical departments, but within other departments in our own institution. Again, speaking from a brain tumor bias, that means with neuro-onc, with rad-onc, getting their buy-in, having them pull in. They're going to be the ones often identifying patients and using awareness for certain trial options. I think we're talking about the preclinical stage, or phase 0, phase 1. You need to have pretty high bars for what actually makes it through that stage and gets onto the phase 2 and phase 3 things. So that means like really strong preclinical data, whether it's animal models, cell models, whatever it is, really big signals. So there's so many things that will be either uncontrolled data or really minimal differences in mouse model, and unsurprisingly, like they don't really relate well to actual efficacy when it comes to the phase 3 trial. Really rigorous design and execution. This is more than anything a devil in the details enterprise. Have to define things up front. Your data management quality has to be really good up front. And then it's just a lot of just making things happen. But I think those last points are things that neurosurgeons are not particularly well suited to do and something we incorporate every day. So again, this is a reminder of that slide with the NeuroNext with all their MCTA and MOU. That's basically where we are now with the consortium after our first meeting, drafting both the MCTA and the Memorandum of Understanding. And those are going through the Ohio State legal and regulatory process now, and then will be circulated among us hopefully in the next month. So we've already had our first study kind of start to get off the ground with some of the site feasibility assessments and site selection. So this for the spine surgeons, I think I emailed a bunch of you a few months ago about this study. This is primarily the work of Mike Safi at USC. Papers on this tethering device, Ligapath, is a Medtronic product under the work under the guidance of Chris Ames at UCSF, and it's really investigational device from Medtronic to reduce the incidence of PJK. And I circulated one of these feasibility forms, and it's like a couple pages, gives you a brief outline of like what the synopsis of the study is and the outcomes. Is asking things like this currently. What kind of surgeries do you do? How many? How many do you think you could enroll? A couple pages, relatively straightforward. Part of the challenge is trying to like hear everybody's practices, because some people think it's a great idea, others won't. And this is something where I really need to rely on the other subspecialties' expertise, because like this tends to people buy this, do they believe in it, something they'd be interested in. So that's area where I think I really need help from other faculty and really everybody on identifying things that make sense for us. As it's going around, we've identified 11 potential sites. A few that not interested, didn't respond. Several that qualified, estimating an enrollment of about 140 patients a year. I will say, generally, clinical trialists rule of two when managing expectations for clinical trial. Like basically everything's going to be twice as hard as you think it is. Like you're going to get half the patients that you think you are. Going to take twice as long as you think it is. It just, it sounds great, but just keep realistic expectations in mind so you're not too disappointed. So we already have a date for the next consortium. It's going to be meeting. It's going to be again in January down in Pasadena. Last year or earlier this year, just me. Maybe here, maybe have all everything the specialties represented, so we can have a voice in idea generation, study selection, things like that. Good excuse to get out of Seattle in the dead of winter, go stay at the Langham, which is a absolutely gorgeous property if you've never been there before, and spend some time in Southern California in the dead of winter. Catch the Rose Bowl a couple days before. I think there are a lot of potential pitfalls in terms of the just general complexity of an execution of a network this time. Many of the things to be sorted out will be a lot of like ownership, who owns IP, who owns data, see where money comes from. For the most part, it'll be flowing through the lead site. But I think a lot of these things will be determined on a case-by-case basis. But kind of a general overview of it, where we are now. I'm happy to hear questions, comments, concerns. Get this off the ground.
Thanks, Sam.
Yep.
That's great. Questions? Really excited. Mark.
So I think a big part of this future will be the gene therapy. I feel like it's a big part of Ohio State's clinical efforts. It's gene therapy through like lean point and that. And I think that to that point, that has the potential to get us involved in a lot of disease pathologies that we're not even currently in, right? Pediatric, but things like Huntington's or some of those like rarer neurodevelopmental disorders that really there's not much of a role for neurosurgeons in right now. But as gene therapy kind of starts to grow and explode, like a lot of people think it's going to, we're going to get pulled into a lot of that stuff.
Like at the meeting you went to last year, for like each tumor functional spine sections, was there kind of an adult and pediatric?
For the most part, pediatrics is its own thing.
Good
Good question.
and Russ Lons are pretty, Russ is a great collaborator. Spine.
I don't want to be pessimistic here, but a bunch
If
of,
you will.
I'm going to.
Yeah.
I think it's
A bunch of
necessary.
people get together and say, hey, we should do this enormous multi-institutional clinical trial network. It's going to be great. These things are network effects driven. And the network effects really come from three things. One is the charisma of the people running it. Fortunately, you are part of it, but others maybe have more charisma.
Unfortunately.
Number two is the perceived or actual success of prior programs, right? And most important, number three, like what you described, this is a many multi-million-dollar effort. And if you, it's going to be, I think, a big ask for individual programs to like pony up a bunch of money just to overcome some of the regulatory burdens of joining the consortium. One of the things you didn't put in your disadvantages of WCG is the cost.
Yeah.
Right? The cost per study to get a study through the door is 5 figures. Right? So industry sponsor is great, but like, is there a budget for this consortium existing already? And what is the buy-in that centers have to have? Because otherwise it's a die on the vine.
No, it's a good point, and was discussed to be determined, but there is going to be some buy-in from individual sites. How much we don't know right now, and actual budget also. But you're right, and because things like using WSCG or what's it, Advara or Vanya, is that what it is? Something like that. Like the human subjects division won't cover the cost. To your point, right? Some places will, but ours. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of practical stuff, including who's actually going to do the work and all that stuff is the real barrier. And I think that's a realistic view.
So, yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say this question from Zoom.
Oh, what is it?
Good. And by the way, while we're waiting, food has arrived. I want you to all nourished. Okay, so start.
Bernice asked, can you elaborate on industry-sponsored trials? How is the industry and institutions' agreements on the final product? that gets to the point of, what I was talking about sorting out IP. Really comes down to like, the idea was, right? The trial, did the company come to us and say like, hey, we really have this thing, it's cool, we want you to use our neurotactic guidance thing to do gene therapy or ligament tether thing, well, then they're gonna own a lot of that. Something that's truly collaborative, then here, and I think that's gonna be determined also on a case-by-case basis. I think it's an important part of it. The data usage part is a big one too, especially, institutions, they obviously are obligated to kind of use whatever data we have to, as much as we can for the research for our patients, and more important be making sure that we own and have access to and can publish on data that we generate.
What do we have to pay to participate?
Yeah, so that's what Mike was asking, TBD.
Oh, okay, it hasn't been decided.
Yeah, I think it's going to be something on the order of like 5 figures. He doesn't want to hear it.
So how would they handle insurance? Like, I mean, because we're huge out faculty, but.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a totally separate, with its own
Yeah,
budget, and it's almost like another.
So it wouldn't
Institution, right?
belong to that consortium.
Well, I think it would. I mean, because it would, with the UW affiliation, would still kind of be included in it, but would probably have to have its own agreement.
Yeah,
to
there are
process totally,
There are
absolutely.
7 children's hospitals
In that.
in
Yeah.
Ohio,
Ohio.
Yeah.
just Ohio, not including.
Not
the
uncommon
big
for a lot of these
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
similar.
I don't know, I'm guessing 10, 12, maybe, I don't know. Those states. It'll be.
Everybody wants their own kind of.
Yes, and remember
the
that,
rules. And
the children's hospitals are all separate from the, it's complicated. Like my wife says, complicated. All right, any other questions? Dr. Mayberg?
So, to Mike's point, there's a way to offset the startup costs, which really are substantial. I know in Neuronext, there was the ability to get money for planning, basically just to have organizational meetings and look at how you would structure the study. Is there any thought to getting industry support to just have a non-specified fund? Wouldn't be about a particular trial.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good idea because I mean, you got to have something to get off that may not be associated with a particular record product. I think, for Neuronext, that was all through NINDS, right? But that was a good question. So I primarily have been working with Kyle Wu, who's getting for Fidelis Junior from Ohio State.